welcome to another episode of Lexitecture, a podcast about words by word nerds and for you. My name is Ryan, and in each episode, my friend Amy and I will be talking about our two favorite words of the week, looking at their origins and history, and generally chatting about how they got to where they are today. If that sounds like your cup of tea, come along for the ride and let's explore the weird and wonderful world of the English language. Today's episode, Character Book.
Tell me about some words.
Okay, tell me about some words. So my word this time around is character.
Oh, nice.
For our mandatory spelling bee, CHARACTER. So dictionary.com, I decided to start there for whatever reason, just because I figured we'd get the definitions of it. And it has a surprising number of definitions in dictionary.com. First of which, the aggregate of features or traits that form the individual nature of some person or thing. Number 2 is one such feature or trait. Number 3 is moral or ethical quality. Goes on in that vein for a while. Number 8 is a person, especially with reference to behavior or personality. Number 10, a person represented in a drama, story, etc. Number 12, a symbol as used in a writing system as a letter of the alphabet. And number 14, a significant visual symbol or mark. And there's like 18 or 20 total definitions. But those are kind of the greatest hits. And the ones that...
Definition in Hindi.
That's right, yeah. I'll figure out what character is in Hindi later on. We'll make that a follow-up sub-episode. That's going to make no sense if I don't.
No, it really isn't.
This is going to be good. A lot of question marks.
As soon as it was out of my mouth, I thought, this is really not a good continuity context.
That's going to be great.
Anyway.
I liked that list.
I want this to be a long running gag.
That's right, yeah. We'll just have something in Hindi. And we're never going to say anything about why.
No, never.
I found the dictionary.com definitions to be interesting because they kind of go backwards from where the OED goes. Because the first entrant into the OED is a distinctive mark impressed, engraved, or otherwise made on a surface or a brand or stamp. And so that's where the OED starts. And it starts in the mid-14th century. So 1360s, 1380s. In both literal contexts and figurative contexts. So the literal context is like an actual physical mark, like the character of a horse on the sign for an inn or a pub. And the figurative use was chiefly in the Catholic Church context to describe the indelible quality sort of imprinted on the soul by the sacrament of baptism and confirmation.
Oh, okay. Right.
So baptism and confirmation existentially change a person in Catholic theology, and so there's an actual change that happens on the soul, and that change, that sort of stamp, is called the character.
Right, okay.
And so that's where it starts in the sort of the mid to late 1300s. It's not until the late 1400s that the OED starts finding instances of character being used to describe a portion of a writing system.
Okay.
So it's not... it talks about how it's representative of a linguistic element or an ideogram on its own, something like that. But it's not until the 1490s that a letter, for instance, would be a character, letter of the alphabet.
Right.
Which I guess makes sense because before the 1490s, I mean, not that literacy skyrocketed in the late 15th century, but it definitely was not as big a factor before then. So that kind of makes sense that they wouldn't need a word for the individual units of writing when most people wouldn't have been reading or writing anything anyway.
Yeah, sure.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
It's not until 1600, though. This I thought was interesting. It's not until the year 1600-ish that it starts being used to denote, quote, I'm quoting from the OED definition here, the sum of the moral and mental qualities which distinguish an individual or a people viewed as a homogeneous whole. So
This is
the
very interesting. I would have assumed that was like dictionary.com, that was the first meaning from which the others broke away from. But
yeah,
it's exactly the
but
opposite.
it's kind of gone the opposite way, which is which is kind of weird to me. So it's not until a couple hundred years later that you talk about a person having a particular character, or the stereotype. The Germans are very industrious. The
Yeah,
Japanese are
sure.
very clean. That's the character of the people if you're viewing them as a homogenous whole.
Mm.
This one I found really interesting, and I would love somebody to. I'm excited for when we eventually, if and when we eventually have a listener base that allows us to crowdsource this kind of information, because someone
Yeah,
out there
sure.
knows the answer to this question. But it's not until 1664 that the OED has a single reference to the word character describing a person portrayed in a work of fiction, or an actor portraying a person on stage in
Oh,
the
now,
theater.
what did they call them before
That's
that?
my very first question: is what did Shakespeare call Romeo?
Dramatis personae.
Like what did he call them? And of course, it's such an esoteric question that Googling it is
Yeah,
like, I'd
not
have to
gonna cut
spend
it.
a while honing my Google foo to be able to get at that. I may actually start emailing some of my old English professors
I
just to
wonder
see
too.
if they can
I mean,
find out.
obviously, dictionaries have their limitations, and the criteria on which the OED is, sort of built, founded, and continues to work to this day, is in itself a limitation. And the
Yeah,
fact that it is recorded in 1664 doesn't mean that no one was using it before that point.
right. Of
But
course, yeah,
given the nature of that particular usage, it seems like the sort of thing that people would be writing down.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because and that idea that it's only the written examples that end up in the dictionary.
Yeah, sure,
Fair
that's
enough.
exactly
That's
what I mean.
fine.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But surely, if Shakespeare, like, people were writing about Shakespeare at the time of Shakespeare,
Yeah, yeah, that's
and
true.
like, surely someone, Johnson
And
or
writing
Chaucer,
about
or
writing is almost as old as writing itself.
yeah, exactly. So if there was anything that you would think would be written down contemporaneously to its use, it would be something to do with literature or drama. The people talking about the
Yeah.
first novels, like, how did they talk about the person of Tom Jones in the novel? Or, I mean, I guess it was just the person of Tom, but yeah,
Yeah, like, even things like protagonist, villain, hero, that sort of. But yeah, this is a really interesting question, Ryan.
yeah. This is
I
where
hope
this really
someone out
hooked me.
there, I hope someone out there hears this and knows the answer too,
Absolutely.
because I certainly don't, but
I'm
I
very
would like to
I'm
know.
very curious about it now. It was interesting, on a tangential note, talking about person. Susie Dent, who is one of the best parts of Twitter,
Oh, oh, Susie Dent
tweeted
is how
out.
I refer to her in my head.
Absolutely, yeah, every time. Uh, Tweeted out this little truth nugget that talked about person, and I was thinking about trying to get it into an actual, like, word that I used, but it's just better as a pithy little thing. And I wish I had printed out her actual tweet, because she obviously says it much better than I will. But it talks about how person stems from persona and personae, and then the Greek before the Latin, to talk about a character in a play, in a drama, and specifically the mask that actors would hold up to portray that character. So the idea
The
that
thing
the
which
word person has
represents
baked
that.
into it sort of the mask that we put on when we go outside and interact with people in public all the time is baked right into the
That's
word person.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the answer. Maybe they were the persons of the play, because person was still held that early drama meaning of characters. I don't know. I would really like to find out, though, because I saw that and I was like, those dates don't make sense to me. So
No,
yeah,
no, not at all.
and then it's not until
Mind blown.
yeah, it's not until 1749 that the OED has an example of a character being used to describe a person having specified qualities or of a particular description. So he's a real character. Wasn't until the mid 1700s. And then from there you start getting into character assassination, all these other sort of compounds,
Sure, yeah.
and then later on in the 1940s, you started getting computer characters once technology came in. Character also referred to a cipher or a key for code breaking later on. And there's all these kind of different little offshoots. But the fact that it progressed from just a mark or a brand was a character and went through from there to describing people and took hundreds of years. It took like 400 years for it to go from, the character of a horse on a sign to that Jim is a real character.
Yeah.
Was interesting to me, especially the dramatic usage. The last thing I have for character is from my discovery from last time, the Smith's Synonyms Discriminated.
Oh, brilliant. I'd
And
forgotten
so
about Smith.
I've done more reading in this and more leafing through. So what this book actually is it's Smith's attempt to do what we do when we look at, in a sort of, hey, Roger, what do you say? And it's him picking apart why words are and aren't synonyms of each other.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
This is just amazing.
So all
Smith
of the
gets better and better the more I hear about him.
He really does. So all of the entries are, he'll have the chief word, in this case character, and then beside it he'll have the word that he is going to parse, like the word that forms the other half of the relationship that he's going to parse.
Sure.
So when we virtual versus potential was the one last time. And in this one, he has a couple of them. He's got character versus letter. So he talks about how all letters are characters, but not all characters are letters. Which makes sense, because an exclamation point is a character, but it's not a letter.
Yeah, sure.
This little snippet that I'm going to read is character as distinguishable from reputation.
Right.
So the character of a person versus that person's reputation. So, quote, "In this connection, character is used of the whole complex constitution of a man's personal qualities. It therefore exists anterior to and independent of his reputation. A common character has no reputation at all. When used of the personal stamp as regarded by others, it still differs somewhat from reputation. It is moral, while reputation extends to other qualities. A man has a character for honesty or dishonesty. He has hardly a character for talent. In this case, we should use reputation, because the mental qualities of a person are not that aspect of his nature which passes commonly before the world for judgment." Which is just, I find it, I just like reading it because it's so refreshing to read stuff like that. But it's, so that's character versus a person's reputation, at least in that one little slice of time and academia, was that character had a distinctly moral quality to it, a person's character.
That's absolutely beautiful.
Which still kind of rings true, because you're right. I mean, when you talk about someone's character, you're not talking about how good they are at checkers.
Yeah, exactly.
You're talking about more kind of interior stuff. So, yes. I should make a note as well that for people who I had someone get in touch with me and finally go, okay, I've had enough. What the hell is Roger? Or who is Roger? And I don't think we ever actually spent it. So when we talk about, hey, Roger, what do you say? We are talking about Roger's thesaurus. I don't know who Roger was. Presumably was. I can't imagine. I'm sure there's someone named Roger out there. And hi, if you're there. Yes, we're talking Roger's thesaurus.
I'm currently Googling.
Okay, we'll have an answer shortly. So that's what Roger, when we talk about, hey, Roger, what do you say? That's what we're meaning, is looking up words in the Roger's thesaurus to do pretty much exactly what Smith is doing in Synonyms Discriminated, and look at the ways you can go wrong if you just were to blindly follow a thesaurus analogous to the ways you can go horribly wrong if you just blindly follow a GPS system or sat-nav system in a car.
That's a very good analogy. I like that. So here's what Wikipedia has to say about Roget's thesaurus and the man himself. Roget's thesaurus is a widely used English language thesaurus created in 1805 by Peter Mark Roget, British physician, natural theologian and lexicographer. It was released to the public on 29th April 1852. So Peter Mark Roget, best known for publishing the Thesaurus of English Words and Phrases.
Nice.
Also, he was born in London. His obsession with list making as a coping mechanism was well established by the time he was 8 years old.
Oh.
Very interesting. He studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh. His life was marked by several depressing incidents. His father and his wife died young. His beloved maternal uncle committed suicide in his presence. He struggled with depression for most of his life. His work on the thesaurus arose partly from an effort to battle it. Well, there we go. I did not know that about Roget.
Wow.
Awesome.
That's fascinating. I did not know any of that. So yeah,
I
there's
also
Roget.
did not know any of that. Wow. There is a story by the Canadian writer Keith Fraser called Roget's Thesaurus, which is narrated in Roget's voice.
Oh, interesting.
There is a picture book biography of Roget entitled The Right Word, Roget and His Thesaurus, which was published in 2014. And Roget is mentioned in Philip Roth's book Operation Shylock as a fake name that the author made up to introduce himself while speaking by phone with his counterpart, the other Philip Roth. Oh, yeah. So indeed, that's why we read Roget.
Nice.
I'm also very pleased because the article about Roget features a comment from Dr. Jack Lynch, Professor of English at Rutgers, and Dr. Jack Lynch is one of the editors of my version of Samuel Johnson's dictionary.
Oh, cool.
And when I studied 18th century literature at university, Jack Lynch's name came up a lot. He is of the opinion that Roget's thesaurus was influenced by Amarasimsa's Amarakosha, a thesaurus in Sanskrit. It is the oldest extant kosha, apparently, and the author himself mentions 18 prior works, but they have all been lost. There have been more than 40 commentaries on the Amarakosha.
Interesting.
And again, so many commentaries on works of literature.
Yeah.
There's so many of them. So what the hell were people calling characters?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, this is going to bother me, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to find someone who knows this. So yeah, anyone who's listening,
like it
if
a
you know
lot.
the answer to this, do not sit on it. Please.
Put us out of our misery.
Yeah. So that's character.
Awesome. Character. Well, in another beautiful accidental synergy, the word that I'm going to talk about today is, quite simply, book.
Nice.
B-O-O-K. And
I like that.
the reason that I decided that book was the word I was going to talk about today, it's partly due to the fact that I had an amazing experience last week in that I visited the British Library in London. And
Yeah, I saw a Facebook post of yours on that.
Yeah. I really did cry at the exhibition entitled Treasures of the British Library.
That's
And
fantastic.
shortly after I had finished crying, I started to feel really, really worried that something as simple as a fire could... I started to worry about the welfare of the British Library's treasures.
Right.
Now, I'm quite sure that I am not the only person who has applied my mind to this problem. And I would pretty much bet that there are better protective measures in place in that building than there are around quite a lot of human being lives.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure.
And I might almost be inclined to say that that's right and true and proper, and that some of the books in that collection may well be worth more than human lives. So I saw, amongst others, the only extant copy of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Oh,
I was very, very excited about
wow.
that. I went back to see it twice. There are in the collection manuscripts handwritten by Bach and Mozart. There are sketches by Da Vinci, annotations and secret notes by Da Vinci galore, because the two very often go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Illuminated volumes of scripture and psalters and Qurans and Talmuds, so old that it barely seemed possible that I could be looking at them,
Yeah.
and just really incredible, beautiful works by some very famous people, some people whose names and histories are lost, because the sort of time frames that I was looking at within that exhibition were just mind-boggling. You know, we've talked before about how Europe is the place where the history comes from,
Yes.
and we're quite used in this country to things being very old.
Yeah.
But I was still absolutely blown away by the scope of time and history and culture that was represented within the exhibition.
Wow.
I was there for nearly 3 hours. I didn't expect that to happen. I didn't have any. I did have a bit of a time frame, but I went in thinking I'll go and have a look at this, and I spent so much time that I didn't have enough time to grab something to eat before I got on my train, but it was worth it. It was most definitely worth it.
Wow.
And so, being that I am pretty well preoccupied with books because this was just such an incredible experience, I thought I would look up a book. So I started with the OED, and in a similar way to what you've described with character, was quite baffled by the number of uses the word book has.
Really?
So the first one that's given is, fairly predictably, a portable volume consisting of a series of written, printed or illustrated pages bound together for ease of reading. What I find very interesting about this word and its etymology is that it's not that interesting. Book started off as book, and it hasn't really changed a great deal as the centuries have gone on.
Right.
There are several Old English citations where book, BOC, seems to be reasonably standard, in as much as there was any such thing as standard spelling in Old English.
Right.
And the first dated citation that we have comes from about 1200, 1225, something like that. A great book, written with swartest mille lettres. 1275, we get The Owl and the Nightingale. And that sort of time is the source of quite a few of the senses of the word book. We also have a written composition long enough to fill one or more such volumes. So not just the object itself, the words, the content of the book. And similar sort of dating for first usages of this, about 1200, 1275, hard to date a lot of these references.
Mm-hmm.
An obsolete usage, a list of names, etc., a register, especially in biblical use, an account of a person's lineage or descent. You know, you see these in the Bible, begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so,
Right,
begat so-and-so. This particular usage a little bit earlier, 1175, and not one that I was aware of. While I was aware of the parts of the Bible that use these, you know, that are just lineages, I didn't know that you would call that a book. Then we get into a legal document, especially a charter or deed by which land is conveyed.
Oh.
Coming from about 1300, although again there are Old English citations and usages for that. Then a periodical or a magazine, now chiefly colloquial or non-standard, the OED notes. This coming from 1659, when publishing began to be a bit more of a thing.
Right. Yeah.
A blank document used as a record, as in the sense of notebook,
Right. Okay.
coming from about 1382. A systematic record of commercial transactions, minutes of meetings, attendance, etc. Also a volume containing such records, an account book, a ledger, or in later use its electronic equivalent, coming from about 1405, that's from Chaucer. So I could go on. There are many, many more. A credit note used in colonial trade in West Africa. A specific text elliptically or contextually understood.
Wow.
A liturgical text or prayer book, especially the Book of Common Prayer. Books containing authoritative reports of cases serving as legal precedents. The yearbooks, for example. A telephone directory. A main subdivision of a larger written work. A major division of the text in a lengthy prose composition or poem. And all of these usages dating from within 200 words of each other. 3 at the very most.
Yeah.
So of course, I got to wondering, well, the word has stayed largely unchanged, as in fact has the object.
Yeah.
It's
true.
one of these things that it peaked pretty quickly. We have papyrus and clay tablets and all of the sort of pre-book methods of writing things down, of recording information. But once paper began to be a thing, the way in which books are made, produced, used, read, it hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me as an example of pretty much a perfect design. I also bought at the British Library a book that could have been written just for me. It's called Adventures in Stationery, and I'd read about 3 chapters before I meant to text my friend to say to her, I may have to divorce Ross because I think the author of this book may be the other half of my soul. However, I accidentally texted this to Ross, which was quite amusing. The particular chapter, the particular passage that inspired me to think, hang on, perhaps my marriage is a sham.
Right.
Really, it's I will read it to you.
Okay.
It's the start of a chapter about pens, essentially, and it reads thus: before I started writing this book, I signed a contract with my publisher. That's how it works. It's not that we don't trust each other, it's just better for everyone concerned if there's a contract rather than just a handshake and a nod. Considering the fact this is a book about stationery, I felt under pressure to make sure I used the right pen for the signing. But what is the right pen? I gave it a lot of thought. At first, I considered a fountain pen, something mature, grown up, signing my name in royal blue ink. But that seemed too ostentatious, and besides, I've always found them a bit scratchy to write with. Using a fountain pen wouldn't be true to who I really am. A gel pen with their brightly coloured inks seemed to be too trivial. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I was. There was only one option. Others may have gone for something flashy or expensive, but not me. I wanted something humble yet iconic, something definitive, something extraordinary in its simplicity. The Bic Crystal. And when I read the words, the Bic Crystal, I genuinely sighed with pleasure. There was a on the train by myself. And the reason that I started thinking about this book, other than to mention it just because I'm loving it.
Yeah.
It talks about it starts off by talking about the paperclip, and the paperclip is often cited as an example of perfect design.
Right.
An object that cannot be improved upon. However, James Ward, the author of the book, who also runs a conference called the Boring Conference, which has featured in past years Helen Zaltzman of The Illusionist.
Right. Oh, wow.
His blog, I don't think his blog is online anymore. I presume it's been sort of superseded by the conference and by his novels and things like that. The blog is called I Like Boring Things.
Oh, that's
So
fantastic.
I was very curious to find some more out about it, but I've been busy reading,
Yeah,
and
naturally.
he points out that in fact the paperclip has gone through several iterations of design, some of which are patented, some of which aren't, and that there's more variation within the form of a paperclip than you would think. Anyway, the book has undergone no such fanciness, really.
Yeah.
A book is a book is a book. Now, at the British Library, there were some examples of fantastically embellished books, inside and out. Jewelled books, books bound with the skin of exotic animals and illuminated and decorated in ways that I would never have believed anyone would be bothered to do.
Yeah.
But the book itself, it's a book. You would recognise it. Most cultures, most people in the world would recognise what a book is and what it's for.
Yeah.
So, in terms of etymology, seeing that it hasn't changed much, the etymology given on Etym Online and in various other places cites Old English book, BOC, generally referred, despite phonetic difficulties, to Proto-Germanic bokis, Bokiz, which means beech, as in Beech, the tree.
Oh.
And Etym Online gives the idea, the notion being of beechwood tablets on which runes were inscribed, but it may be from the tree itself, because people carve initials into beech trees. You know,
Right.
it's still something that's done.
Yeah.
Which I find a rather beautiful, whimsical notion of where the book came from. As if someone looked at a whole beech tree that someone had carved their initials into and thought, a place for people to write things down.
Yeah.
Let's investigate this further.
I like that.
And it continues to say that Latin and Sanskrit also have words for writing that are based on tree names, the birch tree and the ash tree. So Latin librum, which leads to French livre, originally meant the inner bark of trees.
Oh, that's right. I had forgotten about that.
Yeah.
That's
So
really
the
interesting.
Old English word, it states here, originally meant any written document. The sense gradually narrowed by early Middle English to, quote, a written work covering many pages fastened and bound together, or a literary composition in any form of however many volumes, later also bound pages. So
Right.
tracing through quite a few of these senses that I've come through looking at the OED. In the 19th century it was used to mean a magazine, in the 20th century a telephone directory, from about 1200 as a subdivision of a larger work, the libretto of an opera from 1768, a betting book, as in a bookmaker,
Right.
is from
Oh, yeah.
1812, and the sum of criminal charges, as in the slang phrase to throw the book at someone, really quite late, from 1926. I was
Oh, wow.
interested in that too, yeah. The Book of Life, as in the roll of those chosen from eternal life, is from the mid-14th century, which kind of makes me wonder who was on it before then. A little bit like character, I feel like.
Yeah, that's right.
And to do something by the book, as in according to the rules, is from the 1590s.
It's interesting that the concept of the Book of Life seems to have almost immediately predated the concept of plenary indulgences in the Catholic Church, which led to the Reformation.
Isn't that very interesting
The
indeed?
timing of that is kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
And then, of course, none of this is looking at the verb book.
Right.
This is a slightly different etymology. It's given here as Old English bocian, don't know how that's pronounced, Bocian, to grant or assign by charter, which comes from book, as in the noun,
Right.
and meaning to enter into a book or to record is from the early 13th century. And
Wow.
And so I find myself looking etymologically at a word whose etymology is as interesting as the next words, I suppose, as long as the next word hasn't changed too much over the centuries. And what I wonder is what's next for book and the book. Because, 20 years ago, people were saying that books would become obsolete.
Yeah.
And yet, that's not the case. And while Kindles and e-readers and reading things on electronic devices has exploded, people are still buying books.
Yeah.
Because the tactile, experiential pleasure of a book is completely different to the experience of just soaking in knowledge from a screen.
Yeah.
So, while I sometimes like to kind of muse upon future etymologies, I feel like books will continue to be books for many, many centuries because books are pretty perfect the way they are.
Yeah.
The word hasn't had to change, the object hasn't had to change, and all that's really happened with the etymology of this word is that hundreds of other senses and contexts and usages have jumped on to the pages of this absolutely perfect artefact, part of history and part of our modern life, and long may it continue.
Absolutely.
And that's it for this episode of Lexitecture. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed what you heard, please give us a rating and review on iTunes, and be sure to tell all your word nerd friends about us too. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter by searching Lexitecture, Lexitecture. And if you'd like to get in touch with us about the things we talked about this episode, you can send us an email at words@lexitecture.com. Special thanks to the Joy Drops for our theme music, and we'll talk to you again next week.